If you cast your eyes across the portraits of the Tudor court, looking past the arrogant majesty of Henry VIII, you will find Thomas Seymour standing out, a figure of dashing charisma, masking a cold, calculating heart. In the history books, he is often cast as a villainous side character, the reckless madman who dared to shoot the king's beloved dog within the very walls of the palace. Yet those cold lines of text reveal only half the truth regarding a specific brand of ambition that destroyed everything it touched. At the moment he stepped onto the scaffold at Tower Hill to meet the executioner's cold axe, Queen Elizabeth I bitterly remarked, "Today died a man with much wit and very little judgment." That death was the steep price paid by a man of talent who lacked the vision to survive a court filled with snares. Today, let us pull back the curtain on the secrets of Hampton Court to understand the brutal rise and tragic fall of Thomas Seymour. He was not born in a palace. He was born around 1508 or 1509 at Wolfhall in Wiltshire. The name Wolfhall itself evokes a certain predatory imagery, the Hall of Wolves. While the etymology is debated, the symbolism fits the Seymour family perfectly. They were gentry, respected, ancient, claiming a lineage that stretched back to a companion of William the Conqueror. But they were not titans. In the rigid hierarchy of feudal England, they were a family on the make. They were the hungry ones, looking up at the great magnates and wondering how to take their place. Thomas was the fourth son of Sir John Seymour and Marjorie Wentworth. In the genetic lottery of the 16th century, birth order was destiny. The eldest son got the land, the title, and the power. The second son might get a smaller estate or a favorable marriage. But a fourth son? A fourth son was surplus to requirements. A fourth son faced a stark set of choices. You could enter the church trading your ambition for a cassock and a life of prayer. You could become a soldier selling your sword to the highest bidder and hoping you didn't die of dysentery in a muddy field in France. Or if you were clever, charming, and lucky, you could go to court. Sir John Seymour, Thomas's father, was a capable courtier who served both Henry VII and Henry VIII. He was a man who knew how to survive, a trait he passed down to his children. But the Seymour household was not a place of warmth. It was a breeding ground for ambition. It was here, in the nurseries and courtyards of Wolfhall, that the defining dynamic of Thomas's life was forged, his rivalry with his older brother, Edward. It is crucial to understand this duality, for it is the engine that drives our entire tragedy. Edward Seymour, the future Duke of Somerset and Lord Protector, was the quintessential eldest son. He was serious, dour, politically astute, and arguably humorless. He was the responsible one, the one who balanced the books and studied the laws. He carried the weight of the family name on his shoulders. Thomas was the opposite. Liberated from the burden of being the heir, he became the personality. He was the charmer, the athlete, the one who could make the gloomiest guest laugh. He was loud, boisterous, and possessed a magnetism that Edward completely lacked. Where Edward was respected, Thomas was liked. But in the Tudor world, charm gets you into the room, gravity keeps you there. Thomas grew up knowing he had to fight for every scrap of attention, every coin, and every honor. He learned early on that while Edward had the birthright, Thomas had to use his wits and his appearance to survive. This sowed the seeds of a lifelong resentment. Thomas would spend his entire existence trying to prove that he was as good a man as his brother. The Seymours might have remained merely respectable gentry if not for their secret weapon. It wasn't their swords, their lands, or their wits. It was their sister, Jane. We often think of Jane Seymour through the lens of history's hindsight, the pale ghost, the submissive wife of Henry VIII, the only one who gave him a son and then tragically died. We picture her as a passive vessel, but for her brothers, Edward and Thomas, Jane was the key to the kingdom. She was the commodity that could purchase their greatness. The 1530s in England were a time of blood and fire. The reign of Anne Boleyn had torn the country apart, separated the Church of England from Rome, and created an atmosphere of paranoia. But by 1535, the king's eye was wandering. The fire of Anne Boleyn had burned too hot, and Henry, aging and desperate for a male heir, sought something cooler, softer, and more obedient. The Seymours saw their opening. It is impossible to know exactly how much Edward and Thomas coached their sister, but the timing of their rise suggests a coordinated family campaign. As Henry's infatuation with Jane grew, the fortunes of the Seymour brothers skyrocketed. They were no longer just country boys from Wiltshire. They were the brothers-in-law of God's deputy on earth. For Thomas, this was the moment the door to the candy shop was kicked open. In 1536, as Anne Boleyn was arrested, tried, and beheaded on trumped-up charges, Thomas saw firsthand how quickly the wheel of fortune could turn. He saw that proximity to the king was the only thing that mattered. As Jane became queen in May 1536, Thomas found himself elevated to the privy chamber. This was the inner sanctum of power. He was physically close to the king, dressing him, serving him, laughing at his jokes. Thomas thrived in this environment. Henry VIII, despite his tyranny, was a man who appreciated manly virtues. He liked men who could joust, hunt, hawk, and tell a dirty joke. Thomas Seymour was perfect for this. He was a mirror of the king's younger self, athletic, vigorous, and aggressively masculine. While Edward Seymour was busy with the boring work of administration and politics, Thomas was busy becoming the king's friend. But almost as soon as the family reached the summit, tragedy struck. In October 1537, the great triumph occurred. Jane gave birth to a healthy baby boy, Prince Edward. Bonfires were lit across London. Wine flowed in the streets. The succession was secure. The Seymours were now the uncles of the future king. They were untouchable, or so they thought. 12 days later, Jane Seymour died of puerperal fever. The death of Jane was a catastrophe for the family. Suddenly, the direct line to the king's heart was severed. They were still the prince's uncles, yes, but they no longer had the queen whispering in Henry's ear at night. This shared vulnerability should have united the brothers. They needed to form a phalanx around the young Prince Edward to protect their position against the other hungry factions at court, the conservative Howards and the religious radicals. Instead, the vacuum left by Jane set the stage for a deadly internal competition. Who loved the king more? Who would protect the boy? And more importantly, who would rule in his name when the old king died? Before we descend into the scandals that destroyed him, we must give Thomas Seymour his due. It is easy to paint him as a lightweight, a court butterfly, but the historical record shows a man of significant ability during the 1540s. With Jane gone, Thomas had to justify his existence. He couldn't just be the queen's brother anymore. He had to be useful. Henry VIII sent him on diplomatic missions that required both charm and steel. He was sent to the court of Ferdinand, King of the Romans, in Vienna. Imagine Thomas there, in the complex polyglot courts of Central Europe. He was tall, impeccably dressed in velvet and silk, using that booming voice to argue for English interests. He was not a scholar like his brother, but he had a certain brute charisma that worked. He could drink with the German princes, ride with the Hungarian hussars, and flirt with the ladies of the Habsburg court. He wrote letters back to England that revealed a sharp, if somewhat cynical, eye for politics. He reported on troop movements, on the shifting alliances of the Holy Roman Empire and on the strength of fortifications. In 1544, his military prowess was recognized when he was made master of the ordnance for life. This was a massive job. It meant Thomas was essentially the minister of war production. He was in charge of the king's artillery, the cannons, the gunpowder, and the military supplies. It required logistical skill and a mind for organization, traits we don't usually associate with him, suggesting he was more competent than his later reputation implies. Then, in 1545, he reached his element. He became the admiral of the fleet. Thomas Seymour on the deck of a ship was a force of nature. He commanded fleets in the English Channel against the French during the violent skirmishes of the mid-1540s. He knew the smell of wet hemp, the roar of the cannonades, and the sway of the deck. He was brave, leading men into danger, and he understood the rough camaraderie of sailors. This connection to the Navy was crucial. It gave him a power base independent of the court, and later it would give him the dangerous idea that he could operate above the law. It was during this time, around 1543, that the romantic tragedy of Thomas's life began. He was in his mid-30s, a bachelor, wealthy, and handsome. He was the most eligible man at court. His path crossed with a woman named Catherine Parr. She was Lady Latimer then, a wealthy, intelligent widow who was nursing a sick husband. When Lord Latimer died, Catherine and Thomas found each other. It seems to have been a genuine connection, a love match, which was a rarity in the arranged chess games of Tudor marriage. Catherine was intellectual, a reformist in religion, and deeply pious. Thomas was a rogue, but opposites attract. Perhaps she saw the vulnerability behind his bluster. Perhaps he saw the strength behind her modesty. They began to plan their marriage. Gifts were exchanged. Promises were whispered in alcoves. But Thomas had a problem, a massive 300-pound problem. The king had noticed Catherine too. Henry VIII was now in his final years. He was obese, his leg was ulcerated and oozing, and his temper was vile. He had beheaded his fifth wife, Catherine Howard, for adultery. He needed a nurse as much as a wife, a companion to soothe his pain and talk theology with him. He fixed his gaze on Catherine Parr. In a move that tells us everything about the hierarchy of power in Tudor England, Henry essentially signaled to Thomas, "I want her. Back off." Thomas was faced with a choice. He could fight for the woman he loved and likely lose his head, or he could step aside. Thomas, heartbroken or perhaps just pragmatic, stepped aside. You do not compete with a king who has a history of destroying anyone who displeases him. Thomas was conveniently sent away on diplomatic missions to the Netherlands, removed from court so Henry could woo Catherine without the handsome rival looming in the background. Thomas had to watch from afar as the woman he loved married the man he served. He saw Catherine become his sister-in-law, the Queen of England. He saw her nursing the aging, terrifying king. It must have eaten away at him. Another thing denied to him, another prize snatched away by a higher power. He waited. He bided his time. He served the king loyally, but in the dark recesses of his mind, a sense of entitlement was growing. He felt the world owed him. He felt that he had sacrificed his happiness for the crown, and that one day he would collect what was due. But patience was never Thomas Seymour's strong suit. As the winter of 1546 settled over Whitehall, the smell of gangrene and impending death hung heavy in the king's chambers. The era of the giant was ending. But as one sun set, the Seymour brothers stood poised in the twilight, knives sharpened, ready to carve up the kingdom. Thomas believed his moment had finally arrived. He was the favorite, the soldier, the beloved uncle. Yet he had fatally underestimated the cold, bureaucratic ruthlessness of his own blood. The silence of the deathbed was about to be shattered not by grief, but by the roar of a bitter rivalry that would tear the dynasty apart. The seismic shift occurred in the freezing darkness of January 28th, 1547. Henry VIII, the colossus who had bestridden England for nearly 40 years, took his last rattling breath. The line of England was gone. In his place he left a vacuum of power so vast it threatened to swallow the kingdom whole. He also left behind a 9-year-old boy, now King Edward VI. For the Seymour brothers, this was the moment they had been waiting for their entire lives. They were the uncles of the new king. By blood and proximity, the regency belonged to them. But when the will was read and the dust settled, Thomas received a shock that would curdle his ambition into a pathological hatred. His brother, Edward Seymour, maneuvered with breathtaking speed and ruthlessness. Henry VIII's will had stipulated a balanced regency council of 16 executors, a round table of power where no single man could dominate. Henry knew the dangers of a single regent. He wanted a collective government. But Edward Seymour ignored the dead king's wishes before the body was even cold. Through secret deals, bribes, and the sheer force of his personality, Edward convinced the other executors to elevate him. He became the Lord Protector, the Duke of Somerset, and essentially the de facto king of England. He held the dry stamp of the king's signature. He controlled the council. He controlled the boy. And what did Thomas get? He was bought off. To placate his younger brother, the new Lord Protector tossed him some scraps from the high table. Thomas was made Baron Seymour of Sudeley. He was created a Knight of the Garter. He was appointed Lord High Admiral of England. To any other man, these would be the pinnacle of a lifetime's achievement. He was now one of the richest, most powerful men in the realm. But to Thomas Seymour, it was a slap in the face. He looked at his brother, now styled His Grace, treated like a monarch, wielding absolute power, and he saw a usurper. Thomas felt that as the king's uncle, he should have a share of the governorship. He famously complained to his confidants, "If my brother plays the role of the father, I must play the role of the mother." He believed in a split custody. Edward could manage the boring affairs of state, the taxes, and the wars, but he, Thomas, should manage the king's person. He wanted to be the fun uncle, the guardian, the one who held the keys to the king's private apartments. But he was shut out. The Lord Protector was cold, dismissive, and increasingly arrogant. He refused to give Thomas the time of day. Thomas realized that the normal path to power was blocked by his brother's broad back. So he decided to find a shortcut. If he couldn't get power through the council, he would get it through marriage. Thomas's behavior in the weeks following Henry's death was frantic, almost manic. It suggests a man terrorized by the fear of irrelevance. He first set his sights impossibly high. He made inquiries about marrying the royal princesses. He tested the waters with Princess Mary, the devout Catholic older sister of the king. She flatly refused him. He then looked to Princess Elizabeth, the sharp-witted 13-year-old. The council shut that down immediately. They were of royal blood. He was just an upstart uncle. The audacity of a subject trying to marry into the immediate line of succession was bordering on treason. Rebuffed and humiliated, Thomas immediately pivoted back to his Plan B, his old flame, the Queen Dowager, Catherine Parr. It is uncomfortable to look at the timeline. Henry VIII died in late January 1547. By late February or early March, barely weeks later, Thomas Seymour was secretly visiting Catherine Parr at her home in Chelsea. Why did Catherine accept him? It is easy to judge her from the safety of the present, but we must understand her position. She had just spent years nursing a tyrannical, rotting old man, living in constant fear that a wrong word about religion would send her to the block. She was exhausted. Suddenly, here was Thomas again. He was the man she had loved before duty intervened. He was vitality personified, tall, booming, handsome, and telling her that he still loved her. He represented a second chance at happiness, a way to recapture the youth she had sacrificed. They married in secret, likely in April or May of 1547. When the news broke, the court was scandalized. It was incredibly disrespectful to the late king's memory. Furthermore, there was a biological danger. If Catherine had been pregnant by Henry at the time of his death, a quick remarriage would have thrown the succession into chaos. Who would the father be? The dead king or the new husband? The Lord Protector was furious. The Duchess of Somerset, Edward's wife, a woman known for her immense pride and sharp tongue, refused to carry Catherine's train or treat her with the precedence of a queen dowager. She argued that by marrying beneath her station so quickly, Catherine had forfeited her royal status. The friction between the brothers intensified, but Thomas didn't care. He had the queen dowager's vast wealth, her dower lands, and her influence, and he had something else. He had access to the king. Thomas began a campaign of subversion. He utilized his access to the privy chamber to smuggle pocket money to the young King Edward VI. He would slip the boy gold coins, Latin money, bribing him. He whispered in the boy's ear that the Lord Protector was a tyrant who kept him poor and treated him like a baby. He groomed the young king to resent his older brother while positioning himself as the generous, fun-loving ally. He even managed to coerce the boy king into signing a letter supporting his marriage to Catherine, using the child's signature to shield himself from the council's wrath. Thomas thought he had won. He had the wife, the money, and the king's secret favor. But he brought something else into his household that would prove to be his undoing. This is the darkest, most controversial, and most psychologically complex chapter of Thomas Seymour's life. Following their marriage, Thomas and Catherine set up a grand household, primarily at Chelsea Manor and Sudeley Castle. To fill this household, they took into their care the king's sister, the 14-year-old Princess Elizabeth. We must pause to picture Elizabeth at this age. She was not yet the Gloriana of legend, painted in white lead and covered in pearls. She was a red-headed, watchful girl. She was brilliant, fluent in languages, and terrified. She had lost her mother, Anne Boleyn, to the executioner's sword when she was not yet 3. She had been declared a bastard. She had learned to survive by being quiet, by observing, and by being incredibly precocious. She looked up to Catherine Parr as a mother figure. Catherine was kind to her, oversaw her education, and provided the first stable family life Elizabeth had ever known. But then there was Thomas. Thomas Seymour was a man in his late 30s. He was powerful, imposing, and he had no concept of boundaries. In his mind, he was the master of the house, and everyone in it was his property to play with. What happened at Chelsea Manor is a subject of intense debate among historians, but the primary sources, specifically the confessions of Elizabeth's governess, Cat Ashley, and her cofferer Thomas Parry, paint a disturbing picture of boundary crossing that we would today undoubtedly identify as grooming and predatory behavior. The atmosphere in the house was strange, charged with a frantic, roughhousing energy that Thomas instigated. According to Cat Ashley's testimony, the romps began in the mornings. Thomas Seymour would use his master key to enter Elizabeth's bedchamber early in the day. He would come in while she was still in her nightdress, or sometimes not fully dressed at all. He would strike her upon the buttocks, familiarly. He would tickle her violently. He would jump on her bed, rolling around. Elizabeth would shrink away, hiding under the covers, giggling in terror or embarrassment, trying to escape his reach. Cat Ashley, the governess, was scandalized but also charmed by Thomas. She would scold him, telling him it was improper, but he would laugh it off. "A God's name, I mean no harm," he would bellow. At first, Catherine Parr seems to have dismissed this as innocent horseplay. It is difficult for us to reconcile the pious intellectual Catherine with this permissiveness. Was she so in love with Thomas that she blinded herself? Did she think of Elizabeth as a child and Thomas as a playful father figure? Or was it something darker? There are indications that Catherine, desperate to keep her husband's attention, actually joined in. There is one recorded incident, a scene so bizarre it reads like fiction, where Catherine held Elizabeth down in the garden while Thomas took a sword and slashed the princess's black dress into ribbons. It was a violent, highly charged game. They were stripping her, symbolically. For a teenage girl, intensely aware of her precarious status and her body, it must have been confusing and terrifying. But the mood shifted. In late 1547, a miracle occurred. Catherine Parr, who had been married 3 times before without issue, became pregnant. She was 35 years old, dangerously old, for a first pregnancy in the Tudor era. As her belly swelled, the dynamics in the household changed. Catherine's patience for Thomas's obsession with Elizabeth evaporated. The innocent horseplay no longer looked innocent. She began to see what everyone else saw. Her husband was flirting with the princess. He was looking at Elizabeth not as a daughter but as a backup plan. If Catherine died in childbirth, a very real possibility, Thomas would be free. And if he had already groomed Elizabeth, he could marry her and get even closer to the throne. The breaking point came in May 1548. The details are hazy, preserved only in whispers, but the event was decisive. Catherine reportedly walked into a room and found Thomas and Elizabeth in an embrace. Some accounts suggest she found Elizabeth in his arms. Others imply a kiss. Others suggest something even more compromising. Whatever she saw, the scales fell from Catherine's eyes. The betrayal was absolute. It was not just intimate. It was political. He was using her, and now he was using the girl she was supposed to protect. To protect Elizabeth's reputation and her own dignity, Catherine made a hard choice. She expelled Elizabeth from the household. It was a heartbreaking moment. Elizabeth was sent away to live with the Denny family at Cheshunt. She had to leave the only mother figure she loved. The parting letters between them are poignant. Elizabeth wrote, with a maturity beyond her years, thanking Catherine for her kindness. But the damage was done. Thomas and Catherine moved to Sudeley Castle to await the birth of the child. The romps were over, but the consequences were just beginning. September 1548, Sudeley Castle, Gloucestershire. The air was thick with anticipation. The Dowager Queen went into labor. It was a difficult birth, but she delivered a living child, a daughter named Mary Seymour. For a moment, there was joy. Thomas wrote exuberant letters announcing the birth of his pretty daughter. He had an heir. He had a queen for a wife. He had won. But the shadow of the Tudors fell over Sudeley. Within days, Catherine fell ill. Her temperature spiked. She began to hallucinate. Puerperal fever, childbed fever, had set in. It was the same infection that had killed Thomas's sister Jane a decade earlier. It was a slow, agonizing death. In her delirium, the usually composed and pious Catherine lashed out. Her inhibitions melted away. She called Thomas to her bedside. With her ladies-in-waiting standing around as witnesses, she gripped his hand, not in love, but in accusation. She told him, "I am not well handled." She whispered that the people around her, meaning Thomas, did not wish her well. She accused him of wanting her dead. She accused him of rejoicing in her sickness so he could be free to pursue his ambitions. Thomas shocked or perhaps feigning it, tried to soothe her. He lay on the bed beside her, trying to calm her fevered thrashing, but she turned her face away. On September 5th, 1548, Catherine Parr died. She was the one stabilizing force in Thomas Seymour's life. She was the bumper on his judgment, the only person who could rein him in. Now she was gone. Thomas Seymour was a widower again. He was the master of Sudeley, the Lord High Admiral, and the possessor of a vast fortune, and he was entirely alone. The tether was cut. The restraint was gone. And in the silence of Sudeley Castle, as he looked at his newborn daughter and his dead wife, Thomas Seymour did not grieve. He plotted. His ambition, no longer checked by Catherine's wisdom, kicked into overdrive. Thomas stood over the grave of the Queen Dowager, a man ostensibly in mourning, but secretly plotting his next ascent. He had lost his wife, but he had gained a dangerous freedom. Catherine had been his anchor, the only voice of reason that could penetrate his ego. Now that she was gone, the ship was adrift in a storm of his own making. As he turned his back on Sudeley Castle, he walked away from sanity and straight into a world of unchecked vice, one fueled by stolen silver, pirate gold, and a delusion that he was invincible. In the autumn of 1548, Thomas Seymour returned to London from Sudeley Castle, leaving the grave of his wife behind him. A man of normal constitution might have been humbled by grief. He might have looked at his infant daughter, Mary, the last remnant of the woman who had loved him, and found a reason to seek peace. But Thomas Seymour was not a man of peace. He was a man of action, and now he was a man without a governor. Catherine Parr had been the seawall, holding back the tide of his reckless ambition. With her gone, the waters rushed in. Thomas returned to court not as a grieving widower, but as a man liberated. He was rich. Catherine had left him everything, making him one of the wealthiest private citizens in England. He was powerful. He was still the Lord High Admiral and the King's uncle. And he was angry. He felt that the death of his wife had, in a twisted way, cleared the board for his masterstroke. He immediately stopped pretending to be a loyal subject. He began to hold open court at Seymour Place in London, acting more like a rival monarch than a minister. He surrounded himself with young, disaffected gentlemen, the hotheads, the second sons, the men who felt left out of the Lord Protector's government. He began to voice his treason aloud. He told his retainers that the Lord Protector, his brother Edward, was ruining the country. He claimed Edward was enslaving the king. He boasted, "I will make this the blackest parliament that ever was in England." Most dangerously, he renewed his obsession with Princess Elizabeth. The ink was barely dry on Catherine's death certificate when Thomas began his maneuvers. He did not approach the council for permission to marry her, as the law required. Instead, he went underground. He began to cultivate Elizabeth's servants again. Her governess, Cat Ashley, and her cofferer, Thomas Parry. He invited them to Seymour Place. He lavished them with wine and gifts. He whispered questions. How is the princess? Does she ask after me? If I were to write to her, would she read it? It was a clumsy, frantic seduction. But while he was playing Romeo, he was also playing a much more dangerous game. He needed money. Rebellions are expensive, and Thomas Seymour was planning to buy the throne of England. To understand the depth of Thomas's corruption, we must look at the Bristol Mint. In the 16th century, the currency was physical silver and gold. The master of the mint was a position of immense trust. In Bristol, that position was held by Sir William Sherrington. Sherrington was a man cut from the same cloth as Thomas, greedy, unscrupulous, and daring. Thomas found him and made a proposal that was breathtaking in its criminality. Thomas needed liquid cash, vast amounts of it, to pay for mercenaries and to bribe officials. Sherrington had access to the coin dies. Together they hatched a scheme to embezzle from the crown on an industrial scale. Sherrington began clipping the coins. He would shear off the edges of silver coins, collect the shavings, and melt them down to mint new debased currency. He also forged the books, minting thousands of pounds worth of shillings and testoons that were never recorded in the royal ledger. This wasn't just theft, it was economic sabotage. At a time when England's economy was already fragile, Thomas Seymour was effectively counterfeiting his own nephew's currency to fund a war against his own brother. When Sherrington later confessed, the numbers were staggering. He had funneled at least £10,000 directly to Thomas Seymour. Thomas used this money to stockpile weapons. At Sudeley Castle and his other estates, he was amassing an arsenal. He wasn't just collecting hunting rifles, he was buying cannons, pikes, and armor. He boasted to Sherrington that he could raise an army of 10,000 men from his tenants and allies within a month. "I am as good a man as my brother," he told Sherrington, "and I shall be the one to rule." If the embezzlement was bad, what Thomas did on the high seas was worse. As Lord High Admiral, Thomas Seymour was the supreme commander of the Royal Navy. His job was to protect English trade, secure the Channel, and hunt down pirates. The English Channel in the 1540s was a lawless place. Privateers and pirates roamed freely, attacking French, Spanish, and English merchant ships alike. It was the admiral's sworn duty to hang these men at Wapping, leaving their bodies to rot in the gibbets as a warning. Thomas Seymour looked at the pirates and saw potential partners. Instead of hunting them, he contacted them. He struck deals with notorious pirate captains, such as a man named Thompson. The arrangement was simple. The pirates could operate freely. They could attack shipping lanes without fear of the Royal Navy. In exchange, they would split their loot with Thomas. Sudeley Castle became a fence for stolen goods. Carts laden with French wine, Spanish silks, and stolen spices would trundle into the courtyard at night. Thomas took his cut, but it was more than just greed. Thomas was building a private navy. He was turning the pirates into his own maritime militia. He sought to control the channel so that if his coup on land failed, he could retreat to the sea or perhaps facilitate an invasion. The betrayal of his office was absolute. He was the head of the police force, and he had become the crime boss. By the winter of 1548, the stench of Thomas's treason was becoming too strong to ignore. The Lord Protector, Edward Seymour, was many things: arrogant, overwhelmed, stubborn. But he was not blind. He received reports of the money flowing from Bristol. He heard rumors of the pirate alliances. He knew Thomas was bad-mouthing him to the king. Edward tried, one last time, to save his brother. It is a tragic element of the story that Edward Seymour seems to have genuinely hesitated to destroy Thomas. He summoned Thomas to the council. He asked him to explain himself. He essentially gave him a chance to confess, apologize, and retire to the country. Thomas spat in his face. When summoned, Thomas refused to come. He treated the council's messengers with contempt. He believed he was untouchable. He was the king's favorite uncle. He had the money. He had the guns. He had the girl. "He shall not imprison me," Thomas shouted to his followers. "I will die first." The council began to gather evidence. They arrested Sir William Sherrington. Under interrogation, Sherrington broke immediately. He spilled everything about the clipped coins, the forged ledgers, and the money sent to Seymour. Next, the council looked at the Elizabeth connection. They arrested Cat Ashley and Thomas Parry. They were taken to the Tower of London. Thomas felt the net tightening. He knew that once the council had sworn testimony from Sherrington and Elizabeth's servants, he would be charged with high treason. He would lose his head. He had run out of time. He had to act. On the night of January 16th, 1549, Thomas Seymour made a decision that historians have debated for nearly 500 years. Was it a calculated coup, a kidnapping attempt, or the erratic flailing of a man in the grip of a nervous breakdown? Whatever the motive, the actions are clear. Thomas was at Hampton Court Palace. The court was asleep. The winter air was biting cold, and the corridors were dark, lit only by the occasional flickering rushlight. Thomas Seymour prepared himself. He put on a heavy cloak. Beneath it, he checked his weapon, a pistol. This is a significant detail. In 1549, pistols were relatively new, unreliable, and loud. Bringing a loaded firearm into a royal palace was in itself an act of supreme violence. He also took a master key, a skeleton key that he had likely procured during his time as a gentleman of the Privy Chamber. He left his apartments and moved through the silent palace. He walked past the guards, past the sleeping courtiers, moving toward the king's apartments. His objective was the bedroom of King Edward VI. What was the plan? Did he intend to snatch the boy from his bed, carry him out into the night, and ride for Sudeley? Did he intend to force the boy to sign a warrant for the Lord Protector's execution? Or did he plan to kill his brother if he got in the way? Thomas reached the antechamber. He was feet away from the sleeping king. He used his key. He opened the door to the inner sanctum, but there was a guardian he hadn't accounted for. King Edward VI, the lonely boy, slept with a small pet spaniel. As the door creaked open and the dark figure of Thomas Seymour loomed in the doorway, the dog woke up. It sensed the intruder. It began to bark, a sharp, frantic yapping that shattered the silence of the night. Thomas panicked. He could have retreated. He could have tried to soothe the dog, but his nerves were shot. He was a man on the edge of a precipice. He drew his pistol. In the confined space of the royal bedroom antechamber, he aimed at the small dog and pulled the trigger. Boom! The shot would have sounded like a cannon blast in the stone corridors. The dog fell dead. But the noise did exactly what Thomas had feared. It woke the entire palace. Within seconds, the king's personal guard, the gentlemen of the chamber, and the terrified young king himself were awake. Doors flew open. Torches flared to life. They found the Lord High Admiral of England standing in the doorway, a smoking pistol in his hand, a dead dog at his feet, and the king cowering in his bed. There was no explaining this away. There was no charm that could work here. He had brought a loaded weapon into the king's presence. He had fired a shot in the royal bedroom. To the guards rushing in, it looked like a botched assassination attempt. Thomas Seymour was seized. He was disarmed, bound, and dragged away. The gambling was over. The house had won. The echo of the pistol shot faded into the stone walls of Hampton Court, but the shock wave it created was just beginning to spread. Thomas was now a prisoner, stripped of his sword and his dignity, leaving the council to scramble for the evidence that would bury him. But the government knew that to destroy the uncle, they first needed to break the niece. The drama shifted from the violent corridors of the palace to the cold, psychological torture of the interrogation room, where a young girl would have to fight for her life against the most powerful men in England. While Thomas Seymour sat in the damp gloom of the tower, raging against his confinement, the government turned its gaze to the person they feared was his accomplice, the 15-year-old Princess Elizabeth. The council sent Sir Robert Tyrwhitt to Hatfield House. Tyrwhitt was not a diplomat. He was an interrogator. His mission was brutal in its simplicity: break the girl. The council needed to prove that Thomas Seymour had seduced Elizabeth, that they had contracted to marry, and ideally that she was pregnant with his child. Such a confession would not only ensure Thomas's execution, but would also remove Elizabeth from the line of succession, simplifying the politics for her brother, the Lord Protector. For days, Tyrwhitt grilled the teenager. He separated her from her servants. He fired her governess, Cat Ashley, and imprisoned her in the Tower. He replaced Elizabeth's household with his own spies. He used every trick in the book: false sympathy, threats of execution, and fake reports that her servants had already confessed everything. "They have told me all," Tyrwhitt lied to her. "Your honor is saved only if you confess and throw yourself on the king's mercy." A normal 15-year-old would have crumbled. Elizabeth did not. This was the crucible in which the future Queen of England was forged. Alone, terrified and grieving the loss of her innocence, Elizabeth discovered a reserve of iron will. She realized that in a world of men violently vying for power, her only weapon was her silence. She admitted to nothing of substance. She admitted that Thomas had visited. She admitted they had discussed rumors, but she steadfastly denied any marriage contract. She denied any impropriety. She parried Tyrwhitt's questions with a logic so sharp it left the veteran interrogator baffled. In his letters back to the Lord Protector, a frustrated Tyrwhitt wrote a sentence that has become legendary. "I do see it in her face that she is guilty, but she hath a very good wit, and nothing is gotten of her but by great policy." Elizabeth went on the offensive. Hearing rumors that the common people believed she was pregnant and hiding in the country, she wrote a furious letter to the Lord Protector. She demanded to be allowed to come to court to show myself and prove she was not with child. She defended her servants. She demanded justice. She saved her own life, but she could not save Thomas. Her refusal to implicate him meant the council had to find another way to kill him. Thomas Seymour demanded a trial. He believed that if he could just stand before a jury of his peers, or better yet, before the king himself, he could charm his way out of it. He could explain the spaniel incident. He could explain the money. He relied on his charisma, the same tool that had served him his whole life. But the council knew this too. They knew Thomas was dangerous. They knew that if he were allowed to speak in open court, he might implicate others, or worse, sway the young king's heart. So they denied him a trial. Instead, they used a blunt instrument of legislative murder, the Bill of Attainder. An attainder was an act of Parliament that simply declared a person guilty of treason and stripped them of their lands and life. No jury, no defense, no witnesses. The Parliament simply voted on whether Thomas Seymour should die. The charges were read out, 33 counts of treason. They included the attempt to marry Elizabeth, the embezzlement at the Bristol Mint, the collusion with pirates, and the attempt to seize the king's person. Most of the charges were true, but the process was a sham. The tragedy now shifted to the Lord Protector, Edward Seymour. This is the moment where the bad uncle narrative gains a layer of Cain and Abel. Edward was the head of the government. He had to guide this bill through Parliament. Edward was under immense pressure. The council whispered that if he spared his brother, he was complicit. They said that Thomas had planned to kill him. To prove his loyalty to the crown, Edward had to sacrifice his own blood. There are reports that Edward suffered during this time. He was not a monster. He was a tired, beleaguered statesman trying to hold a fracturing country together. But in the end, he chose power over family. On March 5th, 1549, the Bill of Attainder passed. The council brought the death warrant to the young King Edward VI. The boy was 11 years old. This was his favorite uncle. This was the man who gave him pocket money. But the boy had been coached. He had been told that Thomas was a bad man, a traitor who wanted to hurt him. With a steady hand, the child king signed the warrant. But there was one final signature needed. On March 17th, the council formally resolved that Thomas should die. The warrant was placed before the Lord Protector. Edward Seymour took the quill. He signed his name to his brother's execution order. The bond of Wolf Hall was broken. On the morning of March 20th, 1549, the lieutenant of the Tower came for Thomas Seymour. He was led out of his cell. He was dressed in his finest clothes, likely velvet and silk. A Seymour did not die looking like a beggar. He was led to Tower Hill. A massive crowd had gathered. Executions were public spectacles, the cinema of the Tudor age. They came to see the handsome admiral, the Queen's lover, the pirate lord, meet his end. Usually the victim on the scaffold would make a good death. They were expected to give a speech acknowledging their sins, praising the king's justice, and asking for God's mercy. This was the price of a clean death. If you struggled, the executioner might make a mess of it. Thomas Seymour did not make a good death. He was defiant to the last. He did not praise his brother. He did not admit his guilt. As he knelt at the block, he was seen whispering frantically to his servant. He was struggling to pass something to him. The executioner, sensing the tension, did not wait long. Thomas laid his neck on the curved wood. It took 2 strokes of the axe. The first blow likely killed him, but it did not sever the head. The second blow finished the work. The executioner lifted the head of Thomas Seymour, the eyes that had charmed a queen, the mouth that had laughed with a king, and showed it to the crowd. Behold the head of a traitor. But the drama didn't end with the axe. After the body was cleared away, the authorities searched Thomas's servant. They found what Thomas had been trying to pass to him. They were letters. Even in his final moments, Thomas Seymour had been plotting. He had managed to fashion a pen from an aglet and ink from something improvised in his cell. He had written letters to Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth. He had hidden them inside the sole of his velvet shoe. The letters were incendiary. He urged the princesses to believe that he had been murdered by his brother, the Lord Protector. He urged them to rise up, to conspire against Edward Seymour. Even as his blood was soaking into the straw of Tower Hill, Thomas was trying to reach out from the grave to destroy his brother. The blood on Tower Hill dried quickly, but the stain on the Seymour name would prove indelible. Thomas was gone, silenced by the state, but his final act of defiance, those secret letters hidden in his shoe, proved that his ambition survived even death. The execution did not bring the peace his brother Edward had hoped for. Instead, it unleashed a curse that would drag the rest of the family into the abyss. The axe had severed the admiral's head, but the echoes of its fall would ring through history, shaping the destiny of a lost orphan and forging the soul of England's greatest queen. When the axe fell on Tower Hill, the life of Thomas Seymour ended. But the tragedy he had set in motion did not stop. It merely changed victims. The most innocent casualty of this entire saga was Mary Seymour. Born in September 1548, she was the daughter of a Queen Dowager and the Lord High Admiral. At her birth, she was one of the wealthiest heiresses in England. 6 months later, she was a destitute orphan, the daughter of a traitor. The bill of attainder that condemned Thomas had a cruel clause. It stripped him of all his lands and titles. This meant that his estate was forfeit to the crown. Little Mary was left with nothing, not even the silver spoons her father had stolen from the Bristol Mint. What happened to her is one of the saddest footnotes in Tudor history. She was initially handed over to the care of Catherine Willoughby, the Duchess of Suffolk. The Duchess was a close friend of Catherine Parr, but she resented being saddled with the traitor's child. We have letters from the Duchess complaining bitterly to the government about the cost of keeping the girl. There is no provision made for the child, she wrote, demanding money for the baby's nursery, food, and servants. It paints a bleak picture, a royal baby, once celebrated, now treated as an expensive burden, passed around like unwanted baggage. The last specific mention of Mary Seymour in the historical record is around her second birthday. Most historians agree she likely died young, perhaps of illness, unnoticed and unmourned by the state. There is a haunting irony here. Thomas Seymour had spent his life fighting for legacy, for a dynasty, for a name that would ring through the ages, yet his only child vanished into the mist of history, buried in an unmarked grave, a victim of the very ambition intended to elevate her. The ghost of Thomas Seymour did not rest. It immediately began to haunt his brother, Edward Seymour, the Lord Protector. In the 16th century, the killing of a sibling was viewed with Old Testament horror. It was the sin of Cain. Even though Thomas had been guilty of treason, the public could not forgive Edward for signing the death warrant. In the eyes of the common people, Thomas became a folk hero, the dashing, generous admiral who had been murdered by his cold, calculating brother. Ballads were sung in the taverns, lamenting Thomas's fall. Edward Seymour's authority began to rot from the inside. He had claimed he killed Thomas to protect the king and stabilize the realm. But instead of stability, England descended into chaos. The summer of 1549 saw massive rebellions across the country, Kett's Rebellion in the east, the Prayer Book Rebellion in the west. Edward hesitated to crush the rebels. He appeared weak. His enemies in the council, led by the ruthless John Dudley, Earl of Warwick, smelled blood. They whispered that Edward was cursed, that his hands were stained with his brother's blood, and he was unfit to rule. In October 1549, just 7 months after Thomas was beheaded, Edward Seymour was overthrown in a palace coup. He was dragged to the Tower of London, arguably lodging in the same grim apartments his brother had vacated. Edward was released briefly, but the Shark Tank of Tudor politics allowed no second chances. In January 1552, Edward Seymour was executed on Tower Hill. The bodies of the two brothers, the responsible one and the reckless one, were eventually buried in the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula within the tower. In death, they were finally united, two sides of the same ambitious coin, both destroyed by the proximity to the crown they had fought so hard to control. But the true legacy of Thomas Seymour is not found in the graves of the Seymour brothers. It is found in the psyche of Elizabeth I. Historians have long debated why Elizabeth never married. Why did she become the Virgin Queen? Why did she dangle foreign princes and English suitors for decades, only to pull away at the last moment? The answer lies in the trauma of 1548 to 1549. At the impressionable age of 14, Elizabeth had fallen for a man. She had allowed herself to be charmed, to be tickled, to be flattered. And what was the result? She was interrogated. She was humiliated. She was nearly executed for treason. She saw the man she cared for lose his head. She saw her beloved stepmother, Catherine Parr, die of a broken heart and a broken body. She learned a lesson that she would carry to her grave. Passion is dangerous. Desire is death. She learned that for a woman of royal blood, marriage was not a fairy tale. It was a trap. Men like Thomas Seymour did not want her. They wanted her crown. They wanted to use her body as a stepping stone to power. Following the Thomas Seymour scandal, Elizabeth underwent a radical transformation. The flirtatious girl vanished. In her place emerged a figure of severe modesty. She began to dress plainly, like a Protestant nun, wearing high necklines and little jewelry. She studied harder. She controlled her face, her words, and her emotions with an iron grip. Years later, when she was queen, she would have a favorite, Robert Dudley. He was handsome, athletic, and ambitious, much like Thomas Seymour. But every time she came close to marrying him, she pulled back. The ghost of Thomas Seymour was always there, whispering a warning. She famously told a Scottish ambassador, "I will have but one mistress here, and no master." Thomas Seymour, in his recklessness, had inadvertently forged the armor of England's greatest queen. He taught her that to survive, she had to kill the woman within her and become the monarch. So, how should we remember Thomas Seymour? It is easy to dismiss him as the bad uncle, a caricature of villainy who shot dogs and molested princesses. And certainly his actions towards Elizabeth were predatory and inexcusable, even by the lax standards of the 16th century. He was arrogant, greedy, and incredibly foolish, but he was also a tragic figure. Thomas Seymour was a man born with all the talents of a king, but the birthright of a younger brother. He was a creature of the Renaissance, vital, energetic, desperate to make his mark on the world. He lived in a system that offered only two paths: conquer or die. He tried to conquer. He tried to use his charm, his looks, and his daring to rewrite the rules of the game. He failed because he lacked the one thing his brother Edward had: patience, wit without judgment. Elizabeth's verdict stands. He had the wit to win a queen's heart, the wit to command a fleet, the wit to charm a king, but he lacked the judgment to know when to stop. In the end, Thomas Seymour serves as a glittering, terrifying reminder of the high stakes of the Tudor court. He shows us that proximity to the throne was like proximity to the sun. It could illuminate you, make you golden and glorious, but if you flew too close, it would burn you to ash. As we look back at his portrait, that confident jaw, those sizing up eyes, we don't just see a villain. We see a man who wanted too much, too fast, and paid the ultimate price. He is the phantom of the Tudors, the warning shot that echoed through the life of Elizabeth I, ensuring that while the Seymour name perished, the England she built would endure.